Hello, I'm Amanda Roberts, and I'd like to thank you very much for exploring the issue of epistemic injustice with me. We're going to look at epistemic injustice in health and care research teams and in wider life and death, and then consider what we can do to combat this problem. So what do we mean by epistemic injustice? Well, we know what justice means. The simplest way of thinking about it is what is fair. So injustice is what is not fair, someone's rights not being upheld. Episteme is the ancient Greek word for knowledge. So epistemic injustice is someone not being treated fairly by not being listened to, not having their ways of knowing something acknowledged, or having their interpretation of something questioned by other people. So this is more than a difference of opinion. This is saying you don't know because your way of knowing is invalid. Epistemic injustice can permeate all social structures. I'd like to start by thinking about one particular structure, health and care research teams. My proposition is here, and it's that in some health and care research teams, some forms of knowledge are valued more than others. This makes the co-production approach and the research itself less effective. Patients can undertake many different roles in a research team. They can be commenting on the proposals of others or on what has been discovered, so essentially providing a service as outsiders to the team. Or they can act as equal partners for equal benefit in a full co-production approach. Co-production is now encouraged, not least by research funders, but it can have its complications. One complication arises when a team is dominated by the voices of particular individuals, while others struggle to be heard. This can be due to a belief that one person's way of understanding the research subject or process is more valid than another person's. Patient members of research teams can find their way of knowing to be valued less than other team members. It's important to address this inequality because it can impact in a negative way on both individuals in the team and on the research itself. It is a bit surprising that this problem exists now because person-centred evidence-based practice is now overtly encouraged in healthcare. It's acknowledged that decisions about how best to care for someone are based on a combination of what researchers know, what healthcare professionals know, and what patients themselves know, their perspective on their condition and their preferences. The scientist and the doctor in this image mostly get their knowledge from experimentation, observation, and measurement. So this is propositional knowledge. The patient here mostly gets their knowledge from their experience, experiential knowledge. Of course, this is a simplification, but the general point holds. The best evidence-based practice combines propositional and experiential knowledge to give the best patient care. There is a problem with this, however. In a research team, propositional knowledge, often expressed as generalizable facts, can sometimes be seen as having a higher value than experiential knowledge, which is often expressed as beliefs or feelings. So this knowledge hierarchy can lead patients and members of the public to feel their particular experience of something is worth less than more general facts about the topic. So this is a clear example of epistemic injustice. There are also examples of epistemic injustice in a practice context. For example, here, a patient's description of their pain level is challenged by a doctor who can't see why the patient's injury should hurt so much. So here, the patient's specific experience of pain is denied, whilst the doctor relies on what she knows about this type of injury in general. So a 2020 report, First Do No Harm, gave detailed examples of the physical and psychological harm which can be done by medicines and medical devices when patients' voices are not listened to or not believed. So an NHS report on patient safety at around the same time estimated if patients were listened to more, it could save up to 1,000 lives and £100 million in care costs each year. It's worth noting that epistemic injustice can also happen at societal level, when a whole society struggles to understand particular experiences. For example, in the early 1960s, society did not accept the concept of sexual harassment. This behaviour was therefore tolerated, and women who tried to find the words to complain were victimised. So, how do we work towards epistemic justice? Well, there are lots of tools and resources offered to support the development of epistemic justice in research teams. They tend to focus on the ingredients of a systematic approach to patient involvement. So they tell us what to do in what order. Work by the Co-Production Collective suggests that it's better to think of co-production as a practice guided by a set of values rather than a strict system of things to do, where and when. So one value might be, we respect the knowledge of everyone on the team. Another might be, everyone has an equal right to have their voice heard. In practice, our unconscious assumptions and biases can still cloud our judgment about people, however, and this can impact on our behaviour towards them. We therefore need to really work on the potentially uncomfortable processes of discovering our assumptions and biases and challenging them. This means we need to reflexively examine our values, think about where they came from, and acknowledge the worth that we ourselves might give to different types of knowledge. And what we have on the screen now is one tool we may use to help us to do this. We also need to learn more about our fellow team members, for example, what resources they bring with them. The best way to do this is to encourage them to talk and to listen properly to what they have to say. Again, here is one tool which might help us to do this. So, considering values and listening properly to other people helps us to move towards epistemic justice. Another approach is to consider the form in which knowledge is conveyed. These tools and the argument I'm making here about epistemic injustice is published in this little book entitled Anyone Can Co-Produce Health and Care Research. The argument could have been made in an academic article for a journal, for example. But I chose instead to use a little booklet as a symbol of the epistemic justice I was arguing for. In this book, the argument is presented in two complementary ways, as a series of comics and as simple text. In the text version, links are provided to sources for the point being made. They may be academic articles, reports, or other texts, but they are all chosen for their open access and, where possible, for their linguistic accessibility. So what's the point of the comics? Well, the comics are there as a leveller. They give the message. There are some difficult ideas here, but they are accessible by anyone who gives them a bit of thought. At Being Mortal, we want to support people to talk more naturally and comfortably about life and death, so that they can live and die well. We've found comics are a really useful vehicle for starting conversations about end-of-life issues. They're accessible. They help people find their voice and challenge dominant discourses. They also help people to see commonalities in their experiences which supports them in making decisions, including decisions about the end of life. I'd like to give you a couple of specific examples about how we use comics. Atul Gawande points out that the diagnosis of a life-limiting illness brings a massive change of perspective. There is a chasm of perspective between those who have to contend with life's frailty and those who do not. People with a life-limiting illness can see life differently. However, they can find it difficult to have their views taken into account and to retain their sense of agency. So their voices can become marginalised and their experience can become invalidated. We run groups with people with a life-limiting illness, and we use comics to suggest ways in which they might get their voice heard more effectively. And Sam's comic is one example. So in Sam's story, he shares his issue of feeling really agitated after his diagnosis and of not knowing how to get his family to really listen properly to him. This comic strip, his friend supports him to find a way forward. In this final strip, Sam shares the impact of his conversation with his son. The graphic medicine movement has long argued that comics combine words and images which can communicate the experience of an individual illness far more effectively than words alone. So we use comics like Sam's as catalysts for conversations in the groups we run. Everyone's story of living with a life-limiting illness is unique, but people get to recognise aspects of their story, and they can think about them and how they can get their voice heard. I think it might be worth spending a few minutes on how the connection between comics and reader agency actually works. So, a comic strip is made up of pictures, which are in the comic's frames, and the space between them, which is known as the gutter. At Being Mortal, we conceptualise this gutter as a liminal space, a place of transformation, where someone's frame of meaning, their way of seeing something, can be revisited and changed. So, how does this happen? Well, at Being Mortal, we argue that the reader brings their previous experience into this liminal space, and the space gives them the opportunity to make a connection between their own story and the story unfolding in the comic panels. And here they can begin to think about their own story differently. Thinking is deep thinking, which we might call reflexivity. Reflexivity is a fundamental human quality which allows us to reflect on how we think and what affects it. It's the skill we referred to when we were talking about asking ourselves and others to consider the source of our prejudice and bias. So through thinking reflexively, we can become more self-aware. We can critique our natural interpretation of life, our kind of gut reactions. And a reflexive approach to our previous experience lets us change our understanding of it and also potentially change what we've learnt from it. So if you then bring imagination into the mix, we now have the possibility to generate new understandings of our potential future. We can begin to see how it might be for us in the future at the end of life and compare this to how we want it to be. We see this as key to retaining our voice and to ensuring that our preferences, what matters most to us, are taken full account of at this time. So our knowledge of our unique selves can then be held in as much esteem as medical knowledge of our condition. This is epistemic justice. So I'd like to end by sharing our most recent way of using comics in Being Mortal to secure epistemic justice. And this is by preparing people for formal advanced care planning. So an advanced care plan specifies the care someone would like in the future and at the end of life. These plans are particularly useful when people lose the capacity to tell doctors what they want, which happens in certain circumstances. Despite this, really very few of us have any kind of formal plan in place to guide what happens as we become more unwell. The plan looks really daunting, but in fact it focuses on exactly the same big question, which I've circled here in red, which is what matters to you at the end of your life. St Christopher's Hospice conducted some open conversations, and they found that 70% of people they talked to had not even heard of an advanced care plan, and only 3% had one. So at Being Mortal, we want to make this process easier. We want to make it easier for people to develop an advanced care plan in the future by normalising conversations about death, dying and grief in the present. So this normalisation needs to take place at all levels of life. This map presents an ideal view of how it would look if we were all comfortable in having conversations about death and dying, and everyone's view was given equal weight. So we start with the individual at the centre of the map. So the individual explores their values and what matters to them, and they start to make meaning of their own future death as part of life. The sense of empowerment this brings means they're more likely to talk about death and dying with family and friends. They understand and can talk about the choices they have in the latter part of life. And as these conversations become more natural, they continue to feel more in control of both their life and their death. Family and friends also start to talk more openly about death and dying. Interacting with health services can challenge a person's developing sense of self-determination. However, this problem decreases when people see themselves as experts on their own life, care and death. They can then work with healthcare professionals to make ongoing plans within a community setting, rather than seeing death as a single medicalised event. At societal level, there's a shift in belief and norms around death and dying. Death is understood as a normal part of life which comes to us all, and is planned for so that people can live and die well. So how do we achieve this ideal? So it has been suggested that rather than seeing the advanced care planning process as a one-off activity, it should be understood as an advanced practice, an ongoing advanced practice driven by a sense of values. So conversations would then take place at different points in life as people proactively plan, prepare for change, and face mortality. So at Being Mortal, we're using the Circle of Life project as one step in this ongoing discussion and planning process. So the Circle of Life project supports people at any stage of their life to reflect on their past and their present and to consider what will matter to them at the end of life. In workshops, participants are provided with a blank circle of life, which is divided into quadrants to represent the 4 seasons. And facilitators encourage participants to think back, to think about the spring of their life, their childhood. They encourage them to think about their summer, their adulthood, and their present lives, their autumn. and they reflect. They reflect on what has been important to them at those times and what it has meant for them to live well. And once they've done this, they begin to explore their wishes for the final part of their life, their winter, and to answer the question, what do you think will matter to you in the future as the end of your life approaches? Participants express their ideas, as you can see here, through abstract drawings, including comics, through speech bubbles with words in them, through patterns, through anything which helps them to share their feelings, their thoughts, their wishes. And they take their circle of life with them at the end of the session and use it to prompt other conversations about life and death. We really hope this tool helps them to build the resilience to secure epistemic justice in conversations about life and death. If you are interested in knowing more about this or any part of this presentation, please do get in touch. It would be lovely to hear from you.